Well, if you're new with us, our class functions pretty simply here. This is a Bible study class. We're making our way through the whole Bible again. We've already done it once. We're going through it again. The first time, basically, I read the next 5, 6, 8 verses, and I would tell you what I believe that meant from all of my years of experience now. But when you wanted to go through it again, I said, okay, but this time I want to rely more heavily on scholars. And so every book of the Bible we've come to, I've sought out a new commentary, one that's been written since our last time going through, to see if this person has anything new that I don't know, that you don't know, that we need to know about that particular book, some verse, some chapter. Right now we're dealing with Dr. Fred Craddock's commentary on the book of Luke. We're right down near the end, the most important things being discussed right now by Luke, and then we'll move to the gospel that's quite different from the other three, the Gospel of John. I think I've found a really good commentary for you. I've already read it. Dr. Sloyan is the scholar's name. I'll tell you more about him when we get to it. But I think you will enjoy and be blessed by his work as we're enjoying and being blessed right now by the work of Dr. Fred Craddock. So open your Bibles with me. Take one off the back of the pew there if you need to. We're right into the 23rd chapter of Luke, and I marked verse 26 is where we left off. Does that sound right? Chapter 23. Here we go, verse 26. Now what I've done in each of these cases, and we've now been through all 39 books of the Old Testament, and we're into our third book, of course, in the New. So this is our 42nd book. And what I do is go through and read the commentaries and try to weed out those parts that are just arguments by the scholar. I mean, it says in the 7th century this scholar thought this meant, and in the 9th century, in the 16th, and so on. And just get to, but what is our best knowledge today of what this means? And I give you that part. So that's what I'll be doing again this morning. Okay, chapter 23, verse 26. And we're going to read the rest of the chapter here before we see what Dr. Craddock says. As they led him away, and they mean Jesus, of course, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. Now you remember in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus said, if someone compels you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. The Roman authorities could require that of anybody at any time. And here Simon is from out of the country, just in Jerusalem for the day, as far as we can tell. Jesus stumbles, one of the writers says, stumbles to his feet with this heavy cross member he's carrying, and they say, you carry it for him. What's really interesting is that this person doesn't seem to have had any knowledge of Jesus, has not been with him before, but what he does that day in carrying the cross member for Jesus got his name in the Bible. And there are many important characters in the Bible who never got their names mentioned. And it's so important that one of the gospel writers then later will say, now, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, meaning that even people who didn't know Simon did know Alexander and Rufus. So perhaps Simon stayed around long enough that day that he saw and was himself converted and brought up his 2 sons in the faith. Oh, part of that's, somehow these 2 sons of his had become important people. Okay, let's go on. A great number of people followed him, Jesus, they mean, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? Now, Craddock will help us understand that Luke here is alluding to the destruction of Jerusalem. It doesn't happen for about 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. We think Jesus was crucified in about the year 30. The Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70, really destroyed it, including the temple and the top of the mountain. and it was never rebuilt, as you know. We have 2 mosques up there, no Jewish temple. The walls of the city so tumbled down. The significance of that Wailing Wall, it was called for centuries, was those few huge stones at the bottom were all that was left of the Temple Mount of Jesus' time. The Romans tumbled all the rest down. And that Jesus is here talking about what would happen in 70 A.D. Now 2 others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, Abba, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. Now one of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he replied, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Abba, into your hands I commend my Ruach. Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, Certainly this man was innocent. And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Now there was a good and righteous man named Joseph, who, though a member of the council, had not agreed to their plan and action. He came from the Jewish town of Arimathea, and he was waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid it in a rock-hewn tomb where no one had ever been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested, according to the commandment. Okay? Well, that was a lot. Let's see what Dr. Craddock has to say. I'm sure he didn't want to break that up into parts because it's all so significant and should be seen as a unit. Luke alone describes the way to the place called the Skull. Roman law permitted pressing persons such as Simon of Cyrene, and Cyrene is down in northernmost Africa. Okay? So think Egypt and Libya and so on. Cyrene is right down on the northernmost coast of Africa. So he's not a native. He's not a follower by any means. He's just a person who was in Jerusalem that day, perhaps on business of one kind or another. In Luke's account, this man becomes the symbol of true discipleship because Jesus said those who would follow me must take up their cross. He is carrying his cross behind Jesus. Apparently, the following crowd represents the reappearance of those common people who daily listen to Jesus in the temple. Once again, Luke finds in the women an unmatched sympathy and grief, for they alone weep over what is happening. Jesus tells them that the greater cause for tears is for unbelieving Jerusalem. So terrible will be its fate that the fortunate women will be those without children. Jesus recites a proverb in verse 31 to the effect that if such a tragedy as his death can occur in a time relatively non-inflammatory, imagine the Holocaust, the burning when Jerusalem is a tinderbox 40 years later. Then in a brief note, Luke introduces the fact that two others were being crucified with Jesus. The reader has to be impressed by the brevity of the record of the event that has, more than any other, stirred the mind, heart, and soul of the church. The biblical account reminds us that for all the anger, sorrow, and pain generated in the followers of Jesus by this scene, its significance lies first of all in the historical fact of the crucifixion. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. The church confesses this week after week, even on Easter Sunday. Luke gives us the place, the skull. He does not use the Aramaic word. We know Jesus spoke Aramaic. That was his everyday tongue. The everyday Aramaic term for this place is Golgotha. Okay? That's an Aramaic word. The Latin word is Calvary. It's all talking about the same place. Luke calls it the skull. Tradition has placed it on a hill, but none of the evangelists say that it was. Notice? Okay. Perhaps it was because crucifixions were usually placed in highly visible locations that the idea of a hill arose over time. They wanted people to see somebody being horribly put to death. It was terrorism. It was a way of trying to control the people. Okay. A cross is literally an impaling stick or an upright stake and did not necessarily include a second piece of wood as the word cross implies for us in English. It not only warned the public about crimes against the Roman Empire, but also added shame, pain, and slow death to those executed. Let's just stop a moment, and I don't want to appear gross at this point, but if you've read stories about people who are hanged and so on, if you've read biographies about some of the famous outlaws and so on, do you know what they were often worried most about? That they would soil themselves at the moment they died. That they would wet their pants or whatever. And that bothered them more than the dying sometimes. That's what Craddock's getting at here. If you are hung up on a cross and are going to be there until you die, we know that often the Romans kept people back, wouldn't let you touch them, wouldn't let you help them, and that packs of dogs, marauding dogs, think of the dingoes down in Australia or somewhere, would actually come and tear at the flesh, sometimes while the people were still alive, and they couldn't defend themselves. So it was not only horrible death, it could certainly be accompanied by shame and pain and so on. Okay? It was usually this cross beam which the criminal carried to the place of execution. So we see in most of the depictions both of the members, but scholars are generally agreed that upright one, the vertical one, probably remained there all the time. And when the Romans had somebody else they needed to crucify, they had this person carry his cross member out. Would be nailed or strapped to it and then hooked up to the vertical one. So they think probably he was just carrying that horizontal, the shorter of the two. But of course it could be very heavy, and if you hadn't slept now in about 48 hours and you haven't been fed and so on, you can see, and you've been beaten and whipped and so on. You can see why Jesus would have stumbled and fallen. It was usually this crossbeam which the criminal carried to the place of execution, and the body was affixed by ropes or nails. Luke tells us who attended the crucifixion. The soldiers assigned to crucifixion detail are there, of course. They make sport of Jesus, mocking him with the title King of the Jews, saying that surely a king could save himself. Second ones there are the rulers of the Jews, mocking Jesus with two titles, Messiah and Chosen One, saying that surely such a one, having saved others, could save himself. Jesus again refuses to call upon the power of God for his own comfort or security. Third, Luke says the crowd is there, the crowd that hung on Jesus' words daily in the temple. But before this spectacle, they only watch in silence. And fourth, Luke turns our attention twice to the ones on the crosses. The first one is to hear a word from Jesus. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Luke uses they, apparently in a deliberate way, to involve both Jews and Romans in the crucifixion. If they are so implicated, then they are the beneficiaries of the prayer for forgiveness. If both leaders of the Jews and Romans have collaborated here to put him to death, then the ones for whom Jesus prays would be those same two groups. Abba, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. The statement is as Lucan and as appropriate on Jesus' lips as his instructions to forgive and to love one's enemies that we've already had early in this gospel. The second time Luke turns our attention to the crucified ones is to hear the three communicate with each other. One of the criminals adds a third to the two taunts rulers, soldiers already heard. He says, in effect, if you're the Messiah, don't just save yourself, get us down from here as well. The other criminal rebukes him, distinguishes between their justly deserved punishment and that of the innocent Jesus, and expresses faith in Jesus by asking to be remembered when Jesus comes into his kingly power. Jesus assures him a place in paradise, which according to Paul's second letter to Corinth and the book of Revelation, paradise is the abode of the righteous dead, those who have died and have now gone to be with God. 3 times he has been mocked with save yourself, the one criminal adding, and us. Here Jesus does save someone, and that the one saved is a dying criminal is totally congenial to the types of persons blessed by Jesus throughout his ministry. In his own dying hour, Jesus continues his ministry. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Luke told us that in chapter 19. Here Jesus is seeking and saving the lost, a man who wants to go with him to his eternity. In 6 verses, a single paragraph, Luke reports the death of Jesus. And what Dr. Craddock's trying to emphasize here is that the most significant event in the history of humankind, we believe, he describes in 6 little sentences. Luke joins Mark and Matthew in remarking on the darkness over the land from noon until 3 p.m. Jesus had said at the time of his arrest, "This is your hour," to those arresting him, "and the power of darkness." Light will come again, but not now. For 3 hours, sin and death overshadow everything else. The temple veil divided the Holy of Holies from the merely holy place. The most common interpretation is that the open curtain means that the way of access to God through Jesus' act is now available. Let me just remind you. Rosh Hashanah is a time when Jews still gather. It's one of the most significant days in all of their year. It's right at the end of their year as they're anticipating a new year at Yom Kippur. It is a week-long time of introspection, of repentance, of acknowledging what one ought not to have done the past year, but did anyway, or some good or any number of good things one might have done and didn't do them. Of course, there have been no blood sacrifices in Judaism since that temple was destroyed in 70 of the first century of this common era. But as long as there was a temple, when all these prayers had been offered up to God of repentance and confession and seeking forgiveness, the high priest, and only he, would go from the holy place, holy means set apart, you remember, into the most set apart of set apart places, the Holy of Holies. Through the curtain, we are told that inside there were 2 empty chairs. No representation of God himself. That in the very beginning, back in the days of Solomon's temple, there was a beautiful box that held the tablets of the 10 Commandments. And that this was seen as a throne, but there was no other manifestation of God, no 3-dimensional statue or anything, just a beautiful wooden box, the throne of God, if you would. And that the high priest asked God to move from his seat of judgment to His seat of mercy. We think the Babylonians destroyed that beautiful box. It's never been seen since they destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 586, 587, before the Common Era, so about 2,600 years ago. No one's ever seen the box since. Almost surely the Babylonians burned it when they burned the temple. After that, this image of two chairs, God judges us. We will be held accountable for our behavior, both good and bad. But all of us need forgiveness. All of us need to be set right with God once more by God's grace, and we ask Him to move to the other seat. So in effect, the high priest went into the Holy of Holies. The high priest came out. And Luke seems to be saying here, when this curtain of the temple is torn in two, that through Jesus, Messiah, all of us can behold the glory of God, and each can ask God personally, would you move from the seat of judgment to the seat of mercy for me? Please, would you move to the seat of mercy? So that's what Luke seems to be trying to convey here. Okay, let's see. The cry of Jesus in Luke is a prayer of trust in God and the committing of His Spirit, His Ruach, into God's care. There is nothing in Luke's account of anger or doubt. One of the others says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Not in Luke. Rather, Luke writes of serenity, acceptance, and trust. Jesus died sometime in the afternoon of the day before the Sabbath. Sabbath began sundown on Friday. Sabbath, in this case, was also Passover. His last words, a quotation of Psalm 31, Abba, into your hands I commit my Ruach. Following the death, Luke records three responses in the person of the centurion. This Roman again declares Jesus innocent. The crowd's response is to go home deeply sorrowful and penitent, beating the breast. And Jesus' acquaintances and the women who had followed from Galilee witness His death. Witnessing His death is necessary in order that they be qualified witnesses to His resurrection. If He didn't really die on Friday, then how can He be truly raised on Sunday? It's important that there be many people there seeing that He really did die. This business in the ancient creeds that say He descended into hell, okay, that bothered a lot of people, that Jesus descended into hell. Some said, well, that just means He went to the place of punishment and even there preached the good news. But here you see again we've got these differing words. One word that is called the hell fire is Gehenna. It refers to the city dump at Jerusalem, the valley where human sacrifices had been offered before David took this mountain from the Jebusites. Pagans, heathen, had offered sacrifice, little children in that valley. And even to this day, it is not a place where beautiful buildings are built and so on. It still is a deserted looking area. You have the beautiful Kidron Valley on one side of the walled city, and you have this Gehenna over there. And the city dump finally got so big it burned all the time, so it became the hellfire, the Gehenna. That's not the word that was used in our ancient creeds. It's the word Hades. And Hades is a place of dampness and darkness, like Sheol. And the old creedal statements really just meant He really did die. His body too was carried to a damp, dark place, put down, and the stone rolled over the face. That's what it means. Not that He was preaching in some hot and fiery place. He died. He really did die. That's what it's saying. Okay? From the lips of His deniers and detractors, He's called God's Christ, the chosen one, King of the Jews. Both a Roman officer and a criminal dying with Him acknowledge His innocence. From the cross, Jesus announces forgiveness. For Luke, this is the very heart of the gospel, that we may be forgiven. Jesus died away from home. He's 80 miles from His home. And on a Friday afternoon with the Sabbath fast approaching, I've been 5 times to Israel. Usually we do our touring in the earlier parts of the day, on sometimes into late afternoon, but finally we get to the hotel and people have a chance to rest a while and bathe, shower, freshen up, whatever they want before dinner. But our sons and I usually went running, and so our guide said, be sure you get through before sundown if you're going to run in some of the more conservative neighborhoods, because they will not take lightly to your running with little skimpy shorts and singlets on through their neighborhood after the Sabbath has begun. And so we were very careful to observe that. But what we did see late that afternoon just before sunset, as we were running, other people were hurrying. They were hurrying, and particularly the Hasidim, dressed all in black, with the big black hats, and the men with the little curled forelock of their hair right in front of the ears. Those were really hurrying to get shopping done, get children gathered up, and so on. Sometimes you see them with 3 or 4 or 5 little children. They're hurrying to get home, ready to light the candles, offer the prayers, share a meal as Sabbath began. So Jesus has died before sundown on Friday. The proper care of the body with spices and ointments could wait. The pressing need is to remove the body from the cross and place it somewhere, at least temporarily. Now, I think you can tell from Craddock's writing, he would have no part at all in these newly found ossuaries, these bone boxes of Jesus in Jerusalem. Jesus' family had no connection with Jerusalem. 0. They were very poor people who couldn't have afforded elaborate bone boxes or places to put them. Jesus is placed temporarily in the grave site of a very rich man with a very fancy garden to get past the Sabbath day. Okay. Although Jesus was executed as a common criminal, His body must not be tossed in a common grave. The body of Jesus was claimed and cared for by a member of the Sanhedrin. Joseph is identified by address, position, character, and attitude toward Jesus and His message. His going to Pilate to claim the body and His bearing it are acts of great courage. To be identified with this one who's just been so horribly treated and murdered could be risky in itself. You never knew what somebody loony as Pontius Pilate might do next. Romans thought, the only good Jew was a dead Jew at this point. It was really risky business. Notice here that Luke has none of that part about, well, be sure he's dead, and they go and break the legs of the... We'll come to that in John. That's in John, not in Luke. He doesn't say anything at all about that. The respect shown Jesus in death is noted in the description of gets to use things that have never been used by anyone before. That's the point Luke's making. Respect for Jesus' body is shown in the actions of the women of Galilee. They observe where and how the body is laid. They prepare the spices and ointments for a full and proper burial once the Sabbath has passed. They will come back, in other words, on Sunday. Among the evangelists, only Luke adds this observation. On the Sabbath, the women rested according to the commandment. You don't have that in the other 3 Gospels. Their behavior is both surprising and not surprising. It is not surprising in that Luke has been careful all along to place the career of Jesus and His followers within the piety which respected the Torah and the customs of Judaism. They have not abandoned Judaism now. The behavior is a bit surprising in that observing the Sabbath as usual seems not to recognize and mark the unusual event that has occurred. Jesus is dead. For 3 hours, darkness has covered the whole land, and the temple veil has been torn in two. One could defend their behavior by pointing out that at the time of death, there really is little anyone can do. Nobody goes to work. Nobody goes to school. Nobody is hungry. Nobody has anything to say. Nobody feels very helpful. But on a deeper level, their keeping the Sabbath makes all kind of sense. When the ground gives way beneath the feet, when heaven and earth are shaking, when life's reason has been removed by death, something has to be the same, dependable and certain. What, at such a time, could be more nourishing and stabilizing than the same house of worship, the same pew, the same scriptures, the same faces, the same prayers, the same voices, the same order of service? I sat with a family just last night at 7 o'clock and helped them plan a funeral for tomorrow afternoon at 2. And I was trying to say exactly those things to them. Let me help you. We don't need to have an hour-long service, but I think it will help you if we incorporate all the major parts of Sunday morning worship. Okay. And they were very respectful of that and eager to do that, and we worked through the service. Let's do what this beloved mother of yours, wife of yours has done for nearly 90 years. Let's do what she did Sunday after Sunday. It will help us. It will help us. The followers of Jesus found it extremely difficult to pronounce the words, Jesus is dead. The church always has. To this day, some churches withhold nothing in the celebration of Easter while not marking at all Good Friday, as though there could be a resurrection without a corpse. Such well-meaning but clearly erroneous thinking about Jesus Christ had become sufficiently pervasive in the early church that the framers of the Apostles' Creed felt it important to counter that kind of thinking in a fourfold affirmation. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. Father Crossan has written a little book now about the week Jesus died. And Father Crossan has been one of those who is very active in the Jesus Seminar the last 20 years. And in this little book he says, the church has been wrong, he believes, for 2,000 years, to say that the people who waved palms for Jesus on Sunday were the same ones who screamed, "Crucify him," 4 days later. Crossan said that isn't right. He's convinced that is not right. That in fact, those who waved the palm branches kept him alive for 4 more days. That the gospel writers again and again say they would have taken him at any moment, but they feared the people. They feared the people. And they wait until Thursday night when there's no one else around, and then they take him. And he says the next morning at Pontius Pilate's fortress, that would have been only a double handful of people in that courtyard, and they would have all been invited there by the leadership of the temple. Not the ones who waved palm branches, not the ones who had eagerly listened to what he had to say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The leaders, the power structure, who didn't know what to do with this man except kill him and get rid of him. Okay? So we'll be rethinking that. Here at Boston Avenue, we do have Maundy Thursday. We do have Good Friday. Not nearly everybody comes, but for those who do, they will be fed. And they will have an even more glorious Easter when we've been through the rigors of Thursday night and Friday. So I hope you'll be among those. All right? Let's see here. Okay, let me give you a little introduction to chapter 24 because it's really, really important. Luke opened his gospel with infancy narratives. We know Jesus was born. An angelic chorus sang to the shepherds. These infancy stories that Luke told were uniquely his own in the sense that they are not told by Matthew, Mark, or John. Luke now closes his gospel with a resurrection narrative that is almost uniquely his own. The early church treated the resurrection stories as one story, and the blending occurred as it does with us. 2, 3, or 4 accounts of one event, even though each has its own accent and purpose, tend to become one account in the church's memory. What he's saying is, we've heard this story so many times that we've mushed together all 4 accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, we have the 7 last words of Jesus. But no gospel writer gave us all 7. The most we had from any one of them was 3. So each has something from the mouth of Jesus, but they don't have the same things. And to get the 7 words of Jesus, you have to draw from all 4. So once again, what Craddock's pleading for here is that on Easter Sunday, we will pull together all the things we know from 4 different accounts. But if you're going to be fair, and I can tell you, I've heard him speak to preachers, he says, don't do that. Let Luke say what Luke has to say, if you're preaching from Luke. Let Mark say what Mark has to say. Let Matthew say what Matthew has to say. Let John say what John has to say, according to the one you're preaching. Don't moosh them all together. Deal with one story. Craddock's also the one who says, remember, that preachers want to do that. We have a tendency to do that, and lay people seem to like it when we do that. But he says, you don't have to say it all in one Sunday. You can't say it all in a 25-minute sermon. So be content to chop the tree from this direction one Sunday and pray they will come back and hear you chop from the other the next Sunday. So he's begging, try not to listen to the other 3 right now. Just listen to Luke. See what Luke thought was most important. Luke told us at the beginning, I know about those other accounts. I'm aware of them. We believe he has in front of him at least Mark's account, the Septuagint, the Greek rendering of the Old Testament, and the Quella, the source of all the teaching material, another scroll. He knows about all of them. So obviously he's picking and choosing. And what he chose ought to be heard. I mean, Mark says nothing about Jesus' birth. John, nothing about his birth except to say that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. See? So Matthew talks about the Magi coming with gold and frankincense and myrrh. And Luke says, wait a second. That's not the Jesus I know about, the one I've experienced. He came for common people, for shepherds, and the angelic chorus appears to shepherds keeping watch over their flock by night. You see, let Luke tell the story as he believes God wants it told. Okay, so he says, we will try here to listen to Luke and urge the preacher not only to do so, but also to use the notes about variations in the text to help the congregation better understand what a Bible is and how it is transmitted. In Luke, all the appearances of the risen Christ are in or near Jerusalem, and they are told as occurrences on one day, the first day of the week. John has a story about Jesus appearing to the disciples up at Galilee again, that they've been fishing all night, they've caught nothing, they see somebody on the shore, and Simon says, it's the Lord. Luke knows nothing of that or tells nothing of that. Notice that first there is the announcement that Christ is risen, but with little immediate effect. Nothing terribly dramatic happens with just the news, He is risen. Instead, everything Luke tells you at this point takes place that Sunday, from early morning to late in the evening. On one day, right near Jerusalem, there are two people, maybe husband and wife, we don't know for sure, on the way to Emmaus. Emmaus was only about 7 miles, so it's still very close to Jerusalem. Nothing 80 miles away. Not in Luke's Gospel. Okay? All right, let's go a little farther here. I'm eager to get on with this. Chapter 24. Okay. But on the first day of the week, and if you look at your calendar, the first day of the week really is Sunday. It's Sunday. The work week starts on Monday, but the first day of the week is Sunday. The last day of the week is Saturday. So we're in agreement here. This is Sunday morning. On the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. And they had seen the body placed there, remember? Now while they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how He told you while He was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again. Then they remembered His words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Judas is gone already, you see. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. In John's Gospel, he says there were two who ran, Peter and John. John got there first. Luke says Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. In other words, no body. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Now, he probably didn't really mean home up at Capernaum, 80 miles away. He probably means back where they were staying, at the upper room. Okay, let's go on with Craddock here. We've got 10 minutes. The earliest form of the gospel tradition that has come to us is recalled by Paul as that which he had received. Now stop and think what he's saying here. The four Gospels got written pretty late in the first century. The oldest is Mark. Scholars believe that Mark's Gospel was written either just before Jerusalem was destroyed or immediately after. So some think maybe as early as 68, but not before, and perhaps as late as 70. So scholars are right there. 68 to 70, Mark's Gospel got written. Well, Paul is dead by that time. So any of the writings of Paul had to have been done before 70, before 68. We believe everything points toward Paul's having been killed during the persecutions of Nero in Rome in the early 60s. Okay. So Paul's writings predate all four Gospels, and that's what Craddock is saying. The earliest account we have of the resurrection really comes from the writing of Paul as something which he had received. And if you want to read that sometime, again, I know you've read it before, it's in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 15. We pass on to you that which we have received, Paul said. So, Paul was not there in flesh and blood when Jesus was crucified. He never knew the historical Jesus. He met the risen Christ, he said, on the road to Damascus, but not the flesh and blood Jesus. So he says, what has been passed on to me. And so this is the story that was out there. Paul wrote it down before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did. So, strikingly, that tradition, which focuses heavily on the resurrection and the appearances of the risen Christ, mentions neither the empty tomb nor the role of women. Both are important to all the evangelists, that is, the empty tomb and the presence of women. All four evangelists deal with it, but Paul didn't. And to none more than Luke himself. The discovery of the tomb opened and the body gone not only opens Luke's resurrection narrative, but the discovery by the women is repeated in the witness of the two on the road to Emmaus. We're going to come to that shortly, or next Sunday perhaps. And their story confirmed by others who went to the tomb and found it just as the women said. That's in verse 24. Of course, an empty tomb in and of itself does not present a persuasive argument for the resurrection. An empty tomb simply means the body isn't there. But the empty tomb, joined to the witness of those who saw the risen Christ, strengthened and heightened the impact of what the church was proclaiming. Not only that, but the empty tomb supported the very important point that the one raised was the same one who had been crucified and buried. Matters of faith are never finally proven, nor faith generated by an incontrovertible argument. There are always folks who will tell you something else. Faith is communicated by witness, but that witness is not reduced to how believers have felt about their experiences of Jesus Christ. The one raised from the dead said to his followers, "See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. handle me and see. This, says Luke, and all four evangelists agree, means the tomb was really empty. Not only that the women saw no body there, but that Jesus did appear, and those to whom He appeared told. They became witnesses. The women of Galilee do not make their first appearance only at the tomb. They'd already witnessed the crucifixion and the burial, as well as now the empty tomb. The women of Galilee are thoroughly qualified witnesses, lacking only the experience of the risen Christ. They don't have that yet. They've seen two figures there, but not Jesus Himself. The women, 3 are named by Luke, along with others, are mildly reprimanded for seeking the living among the dead. Some scribes borrowed a line from Matthew 28:6 and added it to verse 5. What he's saying is, in some of our manuscripts of Luke, there's another little line there, but the oldest and most reliable manuscripts don't have it, and they think that as priests copied every word laboriously from one manuscript to another as old writing materials would fail and new ones needed to be used, they picked up a line from Matthew and stuck it in there. They don't think Luke wrote it. These scribes should have known better, say the messengers, because Christ had told them in Galilee that He would be betrayed, crucified, and on the third day raised. It's important to notice that the men said, "He told you," and that the women remembered His words. 4 matters of significance are conveyed in verses 6 through 8. So guess what Craddock's about to give us? His sermon on the matter. He's a preacher. He's not just a scholar, not just a professor. He was a preacher, and still living, but retired now. And so the preacher in Craddock sees 4 very important things here. First, Galilee belongs to the preparatory past. That is, the disciples were taught and taught and taught and taught, including the women, but that's over now. Jerusalem, for Luke at least, is now the center for Christ's appearances, for the commissioning and empowering of the disciples, and for the mission of the church to the world, which He will spell out much more fully in His second work, the book of Acts. Number 2, the text assumes that Christ had told the women that He would be betrayed, crucified, and raised. This information places women in the inner circle of disciples with whom such a prediction had been shared. Third, in Luke, the women are not commanded to go and tell the disciples, as both Mark and Matthew have it. The women are not errand runners for disciples. They are disciples. Number 4, the faith and witness of the women consisted of 3 elements: the discovery of the empty tomb, the word of 2 messengers, and their remembrance of the words of Jesus back up there in Galilee. After the resurrection, disciples, female and male, remembered and understood. Remembering is often the activating of the power of recognition. For this reason alone, it is most important that the teacher and preacher share with the listeners the story of Jesus and of the church. Paul said, "How will they believe if they have no preacher?" The times will come when the congregation will remember, and it will make all the difference. But one cannot remember what one has never heard. That the apostles did not believe the report should not be explained by saying it was because the report was given by women. Some very conservative religious groups say so. There's been too much of such flippancy down through the centuries. No doubt men bringing the same report would have met with the same unbelief. In the meantime, verse 11 reminds all of us who celebrate Easter so easily what a burden the resurrection of the dead places on faith, even among those close to Jesus. What a burden the resurrection of the dead places on our faith. I may tell you this story again, but for right now, Dr. Carlisle Marney was one of the great Baptist preachers in this country for many years. In Austin, Texas for a long time, and in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one time he was giving a series of presentations at our Ministers' Week at SMU in Dallas. And I heard him. And Dr. Carlisle Marney had 3 masterful sermons. He was a full manuscript preacher. He read word after word, but he read it marvelously well. he had smoked a pipe all of his adult life, and it gave his voice sort of old deep huskiness. And when he spoke, he almost sounded like the Almighty. You know, he was masterful, powerful preacher. But he ended his fourth presentation that week by saying, I embrace all of this with all my heart, but I must confess there are days I have trouble with the resurrection. And he sat down. Well, Dr. Albert Outler was one of our greatest professors. Perkins became a real school of theology when they lured Albert Outler from Yale to come to SMU in Dallas. Albert Outler was a person one did not push aside gently, and Albert Outler was waiting behind the curtain by the time Marnie got to the edge of the stage. And I heard Marnie tell this himself later, that Albert Outler's face was just red. He was so angry. And he said, Marnie, I cannot believe you ruined 4 great sermons with that statement right at the end. What possessed you? And Marnie said, well, do you find the resurrection easy to believe every day of your life? And Albert Outler said, no. Whoever told you you have to believe it every day? And Marnie said, well, if not every day, then when? And Albert Outler said, only 2 days. On the day you die with somebody, and the day you die. And Marnie said, I haven't come to my own death yet, but I tell you, I've never died with anyone else that I didn't believe in the resurrection. Okay? So that's what Craddock is saying. A burden. Faith has a burden in believing the resurrection from the dead, but it's the all-important thing. It's the all-important thing. In the Revised Standard Version, which predated this new Revised Standard Version, and the New English Bible, which also predated this one, and some other translation, verse 12 is placed in the footnotes, not in the text itself. This is not because there's a lack of support for the verses in ancient manuscripts. In fact, the weight of evidence seems to support including it in the text. The questionable status of verse 12 is due rather to the belief that it's a direct borrowing of John chapter 20, verses 3 through 10, and that its presence in the text would create a contradiction with verse 34. And that's really complicated. Let me tell you what he's getting at. Peter's going to the tomb could be an instance of what verse 24 reports. That is, some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. Remember, John said John ran along with Peter. Luke has only Peter. It's the only one he mentions. Luke has communicated the atmosphere of confusion, disturbance, and doubt. The followers of Jesus awaiting some confirmation of the reports that Jesus has indeed been raised from the dead. Now, they've seen the crucifixion. They know how bad it is. And they are locked in the upper room, scared to death. John says Jesus appeared. Luke says Jesus appeared to 2 on the road to Emmaus. And that's what we'll deal with next Sunday.